It was one of those ideas that sounded better in the planning stages. My siblings and I had talked about doing a weekend camping trip for a while. Just the three of us, no parents, no kids, no stress. The weather looked decent when we checked, and we figured even if it rained a little, it would be part of the adventure. We picked a wooded campground next to a lake, about 40 minutes from my grandpa's house. It was isolated enough to feel like an escape, but not so remote that we couldn't bail out if something went wrong. We got there mid-afternoon. It was quiet. A few other campers scattered in the area, but far enough that we felt like we had our own space. We picked a spot just off the tree line, close enough to the lake that we could see the water through the branches. It was calm, peaceful even. We spent an hour setting up the tent, making sure the rainfly was tight, staking down the corners, and smoothing out the floor inside with sleeping pads and bags. We built a fire pit with some found rocks and gathered wood, getting a small blaze going just before the sun started to drop. Dinner was basic: canned beans, hot dogs, chips. We didn't need anything fancy. We ate while the sun slipped behind the trees and the lake started turning into a dark mirror. The air cooled off fast, and by the time the fire was really going, we were all sitting close to it. We spent most of the night telling old stories and roasting marshmallows. Nothing dramatic. No scary stories. No wild animal sightings. Just a quiet evening in the woods. Around 10 p.m., the wind started picking up. Nothing major at first, just a steady breeze that kicked leaves up into the firelight and made the trees creak a little. We didn't think much of it. Weather changes fast in the woods. We doused the fire, crawled into the tent, zipped it up, and got settled in for the night. I woke up maybe an hour later. The wind had gone from a steady breeze to something stronger, louder. It pressed against the sides of the tent like a giant hand, making the fabric pop and pull against the stakes. I could hear the lake too. It wasn't the gentle lap of water anymore. It was thrashing, hitting the shore hard, like waves trying to get farther inland. I laid still for a while, listening. Then came the lightning. I've been through storms before, some pretty bad ones, but this was something else. It wasn't a flash here or there. It was a constant, blinding light that lit up the entire forest like a strobe light, except it wasn't blinking, it was crawling. The sky didn't go dark in between strikes. It was lit up solid, lightning moving across the sky like roots or cracks in ice. And the thunder was just as bad. It didn't roll in waves like normal. It was one long, continuous roar, like a train screaming over our heads without end. The wind kept getting worse. Our tent, which we thought we'd anchored well, was buckling at the sides. The poles bent inward. I saw the roof of the tent lift a few inches, then slam back down. I felt the floor lift slightly under my sleeping pad. My siblings were both awake by then, moving around in the dark, trying to hold things down with their bodies. The tent felt like it might come apart completely. That's when we all made the same call. The car. We burst out of the tent and ran. Felt like running underwater. The wind pushed against us, almost knocked us sideways. Branches whipped past us, the rain cutting across our skin like needles. The car was maybe 40 feet away, parked just off the main gravel trail, and getting to it felt like fighting through a wall. When we got inside, slammed the doors, it felt like we'd climbed into a bunker. But the storm didn't let up. The car shook hard enough that it felt like someone was outside rocking it back and forth. Trees bent and swayed around us, and in the flashes of light, I could see debris flying through the air. Leaves, branches, pieces of someone's tarp, or maybe even another tent. I looked back toward our campsite just in time to see our tent collapse entirely. The poles snapped, the fabric twisted up and took off into the trees like a sail. We sat in the car for another 10 minutes before making the second decision to leave the campground completely. We didn't even talk about it, we all just knew. I started the car, headlights bouncing across the flooded trail as we pulled away. Branches scraped the sides, and leaves flew across the windshield like a swarm of insects. Driving out wasn't easy. The trail was half mud, half gravel, and the wind made it hard to keep the car steady. A couple of trees had fallen halfway across the road, but we were able to squeeze by. It took about 20 minutes to reach my grandpa's place. We parked in his gravel driveway and ran through the rain to the porch, soaking wet but too tired to care. Inside, it was warm and quiet. We crashed on couches and spare beds, grateful for walls that didn't move and a roof that didn't sound like it was going to rip off. The next morning, the storm had moved on. It was cooler, damp, the sky still gray but no longer angry. We ate a quiet breakfast and then made the drive back to the campground. The roads were a mess. Some were blocked completely by trees. Others had utility trucks already working on clearing things out. When we finally got to the site, it looked like a war zone. Trees were down everywhere, splintered in half or completely uprooted. Limbs lay across picnic tables. Parts of the gravel trail were flooded or caked in mud. Our tent was gone. The only thing left was one bent metal pole stuck in the ground. We found parts of it a little way off, caught in the low branches of a tree, shredded and useless. Sleeping pads, cooking gear, water jugs, most of it was scattered across the site or gone completely. My sleeping bag was just missing, like it had vanished entirely. We later learned that a small tornado had gone through the area sometime during the night. Whether it happened while we were in the car or after we left, we didn't know. The campground had been partially closed off because some of the roads were still blocked by fallen trees. From what we could tell, the path of destruction was close. Too close. We cleaned up what we could, gathered what was still usable, and left. Nobody said much on the way home. I think we were all still trying to process it. It was the most violent storm I'd ever experienced, and I'd never felt so small in the face of nature. We didn't camp again for a long time after that. And even now, years later, I still think about that night. The way the lightning lit up the sky nonstop. The sound of the wind as it tried to rip our tent off the ground. The feeling of the car shaking like it might roll over. And the strange emptiness when we returned and found our things scattered or gone. I never did find that sleeping bag. I'm not even sure where it could have ended up. Maybe it got pulled up into the sky. Maybe it's still tangled in the trees somewhere. Or maybe it just vanished into the storm, carried off like the rest of our peace of mind. All I know is that nature doesn't care about your plans. It doesn't care how well you stake down your tent or how many times you check the forecast. When it decides to show its power, you get out of the way. And if you're lucky, you live to clean up the mess. I had rented a cabin deep in the woods, away from everything. I wanted peace and time alone, with no emails, no phone, no people. The kind of quiet you can only find out in the middle of nowhere. The cabin sat a few miles off a gravel road, surrounded by tall pines, and at night, it got so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. It was a simple one-room place with a small kitchen, a bed tucked against the back wall, a wood stove, and a table with 2 chairs. It had no TV, no internet, and only a radio that barely picked up anything. That was fine with me. I had brought books, a stack of wood, and enough food to last a week. I even enjoyed hauling water from the pump out front. There was something simple and grounding about the work. The first few days were quiet. I read, made simple meals, went for hikes, and watched the light change through the trees. At night, I'd light the wood stove, sit on the porch, and listen to the forest. Sometimes I heard animals moving through the brush. Sometimes the wind blew through the trees and made the whole place creak like an old ship. On the third night, I woke up around 2 a.m. I don't know what woke me, maybe a sound, maybe nothing, but I was wide awake, and it felt like something was different. I lay there for a while, listening. The wind was still. The forest was still. Even the insects seemed quiet. That silence didn't sit right. I got up and went to the window. The moon was out, lighting the clearing. I didn't see anything at first, but then I noticed a shape out near the edge of the trees, low to the ground. I squinted. It looked like a large animal, maybe a deer, but it wasn't moving. I watched it for a long time. It stayed perfectly still. I started to doubt it was anything alive. Probably a log or a stump, I told myself. I went back to bed, but I kept waking up, looking out the window again, just to check. In the morning, I walked out to where I thought the shape had been. There was nothing there. No log, no stump, just pine needles and dirt. No prints either. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. That day, I felt a little off. I didn't go far from the cabin. I kept glancing at the trees. The wind picked up in the afternoon, and branches scratched against the roof. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. Still, I kept the axe nearby and made sure the door was locked when I went to bed. That night, I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, I heard a soft thump on the porch. Just one sound, then nothing. I waited. Another thump, like someone stepping up. I held my breath and sat up in bed. I stayed that way for almost an hour. No more sounds. I didn't dare go to the window this time. Eventually, I lay back down, but I didn't really sleep. In the morning, I stepped out onto the porch. There was a smudge of dirt on the wooden boards. Not a footprint exactly, but something had brushed against it. I walked around the cabin slowly. I didn't see any tracks. I told myself it was probably an animal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept imagining someone out in the woods, just past where I could see, watching, not moving, just waiting. That afternoon, I gathered more firewood than I needed. I stayed busy. I kept checking the tree line. The shape from the other night came back into my mind. Something low to the ground, just watching. I kept telling myself it was nothing. I went to bed early that night. I bolted the door and put the axe by the bed. I even placed a chair under the doorknob. The cabin was silent. The fire in the stove crackled a little. That was the only sound. I woke up again around 3 a.m. This time I was sure I'd heard something. A faint scraping sound. Then a knock. Just one. Then nothing. I sat up and listened. My heart was racing. I gripped the axe. The knock came again, louder this time. Then silence. I didn't move. I stayed there, sitting up in bed, holding the axe, not making a sound. No more knocks came. I waited until the sky started to get light. Then I finally moved. When I opened the door, I saw it. A small mark low on the wood. A scrape like something had clawed or dragged against it. I stepped outside, slowly, and scanned the clearing. Just at the edge of the trees, I saw something move, low to the ground. It shifted behind a tree, and then it was gone. I didn't follow. I went back inside and locked the door. That morning, I packed my things. I didn't even eat breakfast. I loaded up the truck and drove out, bouncing down the gravel road without looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone the full story, just that I cut my trip short, that the weather was bad, or that I wasn't feeling well. But the truth is, something was out there. I don't know what. Maybe a person, maybe something else. But it wasn't right. It watched, waited, and came close at night. And I don't think I was supposed to see it. It was early July when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the northern woods. I had the time off work, the forecast looked decent, and I just needed a break from everything. I wasn't looking for anything intense, just a few days of quiet, no phone, no people, just me, the lake, and the trees. I picked a place I'd found on a backcountry forum, a remote camping spot only accessible by canoe. It was supposed to be peaceful, beautiful, and most of all, isolated. I drove for hours on winding roads through endless stretches of pine and spruce before finally reaching the edge of the lake. The sky was a pale blue with big, slow-moving clouds, and the sun was warm without being overbearing. I parked my truck by a small launch spot, loaded up the canoe with my pack, tent, and a few essentials, and pushed off. The lake was glassy and calm, the kind of stillness that amplifies every little splash and bird call. The paddle took a little over an hour. The site I had in mind was on a little peninsula that jutted out from the mainland, surrounded by water on 3 sides. It had a rocky shore, a flat spot for a tent, and some decent tree cover. I pulled the canoe up, unpacked my gear, and started setting up. I took my time, collected some firewood, rigged a tarp over my tent for extra weather protection, set up a small cooking area near the fire pit, and even brought a book to relax with. That first evening was just about perfect. I cooked some dehydrated food over my little stove, watched the sunset paint the lake orange and gold, and stayed up listening to the loons calling back and forth across the water. The stars came out thick, like someone had dumped salt across a black tablecloth. I crawled into my sleeping bag feeling full, calm, and more relaxed than I'd been in months. The second day was uneventful in the best way. I paddled out to a few nearby islands, did some fishing with little success, and spent most of the day just taking it easy. I kept my food hung high between 2 trees, my trash bag sealed and hung too, and made sure to clean up thoroughly after meals. I knew bears were a possibility, but I'd camped alone before and never had an issue. Plus, it was early enough in the season that I figured I might not see much wildlife beyond the odd deer or squirrel. That night, I was dozing off to sleep when I heard something in the bushes behind the tent. It was a steady rustling, not frantic, not loud, but definitely close. At first, I thought it was a raccoon or a porcupine. I sat up a bit, listening, trying to place the sound. It moved slowly, shuffling and sniffing. My heart rate picked up. I didn't have a weapon, just some bear spray and a hatchet by the zipper flap of the tent. I stayed still and waited. Then, without warning, the whole left side of the tent collapsed inward on top of me. It wasn't a full cave-in. More like something heavy had pressed against it and then backed off, but it was enough to pin my shoulder and part of my chest for a moment before letting up. I flailed instinctively, trying to push it off, thinking the pole had snapped or something worse. The pressure lifted almost immediately. I scrambled upright inside the tent, my hands shaking, breathing hard. Outside, I could hear quick shuffling and the sound of something brushing against the bushes. I unzipped the flap just enough to peek out. About 10 feet away stood a black bear, mid-sized, maybe 200 pounds, looking as startled as I felt. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't pawing the ground or showing its teeth. It just stood there, blinking, like it was trying to figure out what had just happened. For a long moment, we both just stared. The bear's head was tilted slightly, its nose twitching. It looked like a cartoon character who had accidentally knocked over a lamp and wasn't sure if it should apologize or sneak away. Its ears were up, its whole body alert but not hostile. It was just confused, like it had stumbled into something unexpected and was now trying to figure out its next move. The bear shifted its weight, turned slowly, and without any real panic, trotted back into the woods.
No dramatic dash.
No angry huff, just a quiet exit like it had wandered into the wrong room and realized it was time to leave. I sat there in the doorway of the tent for a long time. I wasn't afraid in the screaming, heart-pounding way people describe when they're in danger. It was more like a deep, rooted unease. I got out, flashlight in hand, checked around the site. No torn bags, no missing food. My bear hang was untouched. Just a dent in the side of my tent where the pole had bent a little. I didn't go back to sleep. I stayed up with my headlamp on, sitting in the camp chair, listening to the woods. Morning came slow and gray. A light mist hung over the lake, and everything felt damp and still. I made coffee and oatmeal and tried to settle back into the peaceful rhythm, but it wasn't the same. Every sound in the trees made me tense. I kept thinking about the way the tent had collapsed, the way the bear had looked at me, like it hadn't meant to cause trouble, like it had just made a mistake. I packed up slowly, not because I was rushing to leave, but because I wanted to do it right. Double-check everything, make sure the fire pit was cold, the trash packed out, the canoe balanced. I took one last look at the site before pushing off. The place was still beautiful, still quiet, still worth coming to, but I knew I wouldn't forget that night. Paddling back across the lake, I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see the bear watching from the shadows. I didn't, of course. It was gone, probably back to sniffing around for berries or grubs. It wasn't an evil creature or a monster, just a big animal with poor footing. When I got back to the truck, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, tension, gratitude. I loaded up, took one last deep breath of the pine-heavy air, and started the long drive home. In the weeks after, I told a few close friends about the trip. I didn't make it into some big dramatic story. I just said a bear fell on my tent, and we had a moment. It wasn't angry. It wasn't scary in the usual sense, but it stayed with me. That experience changed the way I see the woods. Not in a bad way, but in a way that reminded me that I'm the guest out there. Nature doesn't care about your plans or your peace and quiet. It just is. And sometimes that means getting sat on by a bear who didn't mean any harm. Looking back, it's almost funny. I can still picture that bear's face. Wide-eyed, ears perked, looking at me like, "Oh no, did I just ruin something? My bad." And then walking off like it had somewhere else to be. That's the story I tell now when people ask if I've ever had a scary experience camping. It's not the scariest one out there, but it's the one I remember best. Because it was real. Because it reminded me how small I am out there. And because, honestly, how many people can say they've been gently sat on by a confused bear? I still go camping. I still sleep in tents. But now I tie my bear hang a little higher, check the bushes twice, and never forget that somewhere out there is a bear with a story too. About a night it tripped over a nylon bubble and scared some weird human half to death. I'll start by saying I've always enjoyed being outdoors, but I wouldn't call myself some rugged survivalist or anything like that. I grew up hiking in Michigan, mostly day hikes, some overnighters when I had the gear for it, but nothing extreme. When my girlfriend and I started dating, we found out we both had this mutual love for hiking and camping, and after a while, it just became something we did pretty regularly. It wasn't about adventure or adrenaline. It was just peaceful. That's what I liked about it. The quiet, the simplicity, just you and the woods and the trail. It was sometime in late spring, maybe early May. The temperatures had started getting comfortable again, and most of the snowmelt was done. It had been wet a couple weeks before, but we'd had a good stretch of dry days, so the trails were solid and dry. We picked a stretch of the North Country Trail that neither of us had done before. It was one of the more wooded sections, winding through dense hardwood forest and climbing gradually through a few small ridges. Nothing too crazy, just a peaceful overnight hike to kick off the season. We started mid-morning, parked at a trailhead off one of the access roads, and made our way in with the plan to hike maybe 8 to 10 miles the first day. We weren't rushing. It was warm but not hot, maybe mid-60s. The air smelled clean. Pine and damp leaves and that sweet earthy smell you only get in the woods in spring. The trail was well marked. You could hear birds most of the time, some woodpeckers in the distance. Squirrels darted around, rustling the brush. The terrain wasn't too challenging, but it kept things interesting. Some narrow switchbacks, some low, marshy spots with footbridges, a few stretches where the canopy opened up and sunlight poured through. We talked a little, but mostly we just walked and took it all in. By early afternoon, we had made good progress. We had maybe another mile or two before our goal, which was just a small marked backcountry camping area with a fire ring and a couple of flat clearings. It wasn't official like a campground, just a place people used and kept clean. Our plan was to hang our hammocks, cook dinner, and sleep light before heading back the next day. But about 2/3 of the way there, we saw a nice little spot tucked maybe 30 feet off the trail. A cluster of trees close enough for hammocks, mostly flat ground, and just enough cover to feel out of sight. It wasn't an official site, but it looked used before. No trash or signs of fires, just natural clearing. Felt right. We figured we'd rest there for a bit before pushing on. Maybe even just stay if we felt good about it. We set up our hammocks pretty quick. We'd gotten decent at it by now, webbing straps around trees, making sure they weren't dead, giving a few good tugs before committing. Once everything was up, we just laid there, swaying gently in the shade. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in once you stop walking. No cars, no background hum of anything, just occasional chirps from birds, wind through the trees, and the light creak of the hammock straps. I must have dozed off a little. Not deep sleep, just that warm, still kind of tired kind of rest where your body relaxes but your ears still pick up everything. At some point, I heard a rustle. Not a branch snapping, not leaves falling, but that slow, deliberate crunch of something stepping through dry underbrush. It was close, like 10 feet away, maybe less. I opened my eyes and slowly sat up just enough to look over the edge of the hammock. There was a coyote standing just inside the brush line. Thin, grayish-brown fur, ribs slightly visible, tail low. We made eye contact for a second, one of those locked stares where you could feel both sides waiting to see what the other would do. Then it turned sharply and darted away, disappearing into the trees with barely any noise. But before I could even think much about that, I heard another sound on the opposite side of us. Bigger, heavier, like a branch cracking, followed by a sudden burst of movement, like something bolted away fast. I didn't see what it was. I only caught the noise and the blur through the trees. But it was definitely larger than the coyote. Could have been a deer, maybe, or something else. Whatever it was, it had been even closer than the coyote. That shook me a little. There's something about being between two wild animals that don't know you're there until they're practically on top of you. We hadn't been loud. We were 30 feet off the trail, quiet, still, not cooking food or making noise. For all I knew, the coyote hadn't been watching us at all. Maybe it was tracking something else. But either way, being that close to two different wild animals in under a minute didn't sit right. I unhooked from the hammock and started packing up. My girlfriend was already doing the same. No words, just a shared sense that we should keep moving. We packed quickly, quietly, double-checked for trash, and got back on the trail. The sun was still a couple hours from setting, but the light was starting to soften. Shadows stretched longer across the trail, and everything had that golden tone to it. We walked a little faster than before, not a panic pace, but steady. The trees felt thicker somehow, like they'd closed in behind us. The breeze had died down too. It was warm, still quiet again. About 5 minutes later, maybe less, we rounded a bend and came face to face with a black bear cub. It was maybe 15 or 20 feet ahead, just off the trail, standing beside a fallen log. It must have heard us at the same time we saw it, because it froze. It was smaller than I expected, with that soft, dark fur and clumsy little paws. But all I could think in that moment was, where is the mother? The cub made this quick huffing sound and bolted up the ridge away from us, crashing through the underbrush like a bowling ball. I never saw the mother, and we didn't wait around. We just kept walking. We didn't run, but we didn't stop either. I kept checking behind us every few seconds, half expecting to see a full-sized bear sprinting after us. Nothing came. After that, everything felt different. We were still on the trail, still surrounded by the same trees and birds and air, but it didn't feel calm anymore. My ears were dialed in to every noise, every twig snap or flutter of leaves. Every squirrel sounded like something bigger. We didn't talk. We just walked, minds racing, hearts high in our chests. We finally reached the planned campsite maybe 30 minutes later. It was quiet, untouched, fire ring intact, trees spaced perfectly for hammocks. A small stream ran nearby, slow and clean. Under different circumstances, it would have felt perfect. But I didn't want to stay there anymore. Not that night. We didn't say it, but we both just started repacking again after a short break. There was still daylight left. We could push further, maybe even head all the way back out. We didn't eat much, just energy bars and water. Neither of us had an appetite. We hiked another hour, maybe more, before stopping for real. We ended up camping closer to the car than we planned, in a less scenic spot near a gravel turnout. It was flat and boring, but it felt safe. We strung the hammocks again, this time between younger trees, farther from the woods and with a clearer view of everything around us. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept one ear open the whole time, even though nothing ever came. I heard an owl once, some distant coyotes later on, but nothing near us. No heavy steps, no surprise visitors, just the woods doing what they do. In the morning, everything looked different again. Bright, peaceful. That feeling of pressure was gone, like whatever weird tension had been hanging in the trees the night before had burned off with the dew. We made a small breakfast, instant oats and coffee, and packed up without much to say. The hike back to the car was quiet. It felt like we had walked out of something without even realizing we were walking into it. No big incident, no confrontation, just a series of things that lined up close together, too close. The coyote, the unseen animal, the bear cub, each one manageable on its own. But stacked like that, one after the other, it felt like we had threaded a needle without knowing it. Back at the car, I remember brushing the dirt off my boots and just standing there for a minute, feeling the weight of it all settle in. The stillness, the luck, the fact that nothing actually happened, but so much almost did. We've gone camping since then, even back on the North Country Trail, but we don't hang hammocks that close to the trail anymore. We don't stop unless we're sure. We don't assume quiet means alone. It's not fear, just awareness, a new kind of respect. And I still think about that moment in the hammock sometimes. Looking up, seeing the coyote, hearing something heavier behind me, how easy it is to miss the signs, how close you can come without even knowing it. Because the woods don't warn you, they just are. I've always liked being alone in the woods. Something about it calms me in a way nothing else can. So when I booked a week off work and found a cheap little off-grid cabin rental way up in the northern woods, I jumped on it. It wasn't fancy, just a single-room place with a wood stove, a basic bed, a water pump out back, and no cell reception. That's what I wanted. No distractions, just a quiet place to think. I got there late in the afternoon. It was already starting to cool down, with that crisp autumn bite in the air. The trees were mostly bare, the ground scattered with dry leaves. The cabin was just a few hundred feet from a small lake. No other cabins nearby. No traffic, no sounds except the wind and the occasional creaking of old trees. I settled in pretty fast. Brought my food in a cooler, my clothes in one backpack, and a few paperbacks. First night was uneventful. I made a fire in the stove, cooked some canned chili, and sat on the porch with a beer. I could hear the breeze moving through the trees and small splashes from the lake. Maybe frogs. I slept like a rock. The second day, I did a short hike around the lake, took some photos, made a fire pit out back, and sat out there until the sun went down. That night, I started to feel a little watched. It was subtle. I chalked it up to being out of my usual environment. I'd been in the woods plenty before, but there's always a small adjustment period. It was dead silent around 10 p.m. when I started hearing this soft rustling from the trees about 50 feet back. I turned off my lantern and stood there listening. Whatever it was stopped as soon as I did. Could have been a raccoon, maybe even a deer, but it was quiet again for a long time, so I eventually went inside. The next morning, I saw something odd out back. Just outside the tree line were these small depressions in the soil. Not big enough to be human tracks, not shaped right either. But they weren't deer either. Too long, narrow, almost like a dog's paw but stretched. And only two sets of tracks, like something walking upright. I stared at them a while, not really sure what I was seeing. I was trained enough to recognize animal sign, but this didn't match anything I could think of. Later that day, I walked a few miles deeper into the woods and came across an old hunting blind. Falling apart, clearly hadn't been used in years. Around it were more of those same narrow tracks. I crouched and took a few photos with my phone, even though I knew I wouldn't have a signal to send them anywhere. That night was worse. I woke up around 1 a.m. to this sharp scraping sound on the back wall of the cabin. Not constant, just one scrape, then silence, then again, like claws or nails on the wood. I didn't move, just lay there listening, eyes open in the dark. The stove had burned out and the cabin was cold. I waited, counting each minute. Then it stopped. I must have fallen asleep again eventually because I woke up at dawn. First thing I did was go outside and walk to the back of the cabin. 3 fresh scratches on the siding, each one maybe a foot long, just shallow scrapes. But the weirdest part? Right below them were more of those 2-legged dog-like tracks. They weren't deep, but they were clear. At this point, I started considering packing up. It wasn't full-on fear, not yet, but I was definitely uncomfortable. Still, I told myself it was probably some animal, maybe injured, maybe sick, and I'd just keep a closer eye out. That night, I sat on the porch until late. I didn't bring the lantern. I just sat there in the dark, letting my eyes adjust. I had a small knife on me, but I knew that wouldn't do much against anything big. Around 11 p.m., I saw movement near the tree line. Not fast, just something walking. At first I thought it was a bear standing upright, but it wasn't thick enough. Its outline was too narrow. Then I thought maybe it was a person in dark clothes. But the way it moved, it wasn't quite human. Its arms were too long, hanging low, and it didn't move like a person. Took a step forward, and that's when I saw the shape of its legs in the moonlight. Bent back, like a dog's hind legs, but standing straight up. The upper body looked almost human, but the legs were wrong. And it didn't make a sound. Not one branch snapped underfoot. Not one breath. Just that slow, quiet walk. I backed inside and locked the door. Sat on the bed with the knife in my hand and didn't sleep until the sky turned gray. Next morning, I packed everything. I couldn't explain what I'd seen. I wasn't about to try, but I knew I wasn't going to stay another night. As I loaded my gear into the truck, I saw a set of those same strange tracks leading across the front of the cabin, as if something had walked straight up to the porch and just stared at the door for a while. I left fast, didn't even bother cleaning up the cabin. Later that day, after I was back in town and had cell signal again, I tried searching for similar sightings. There were some wild stories, people describing strange animals, bipedal canines, weird figures in the woods, but none of it felt real until that week. To this day, I don't know what I saw, but I'll never go back to that part of the woods again. And I'll never feel quite the same sleeping in a cabin, especially one surrounded by forest, because every so often, when the night's especially quiet, I'll catch myself listening for that sound. The soft crunch of dry leaves under 2 long, thin legs. I had been wanting to backpack through the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho for years before I finally committed to the trip. There was something about that stretch of jagged peaks, high alpine lakes, and narrow valleys that had always called to me. I wasn't chasing some Instagram post or trying to tick it off a list. I just liked the idea of being out there, in a place that felt wild and untouched. When the time finally came, I planned carefully, pulled out maps, marked distances, factored in elevation gain, water sources, campsites. I wasn't new to backpacking. I knew what I was doing. I still do. The group I went with was small. Just 3 of us, including me. All of us were experienced, capable, not the kind to do anything reckless. We drove up from Boise and parked at the trailhead early in the morning, just after sunup. The air had that cold bite to it that you only get in the mountains, even in the summer. I remember pulling on my pack and feeling the weight settle in just right. It's a good feeling, like everything you need is strapped to your back and you can go wherever you want. We followed the trail for most of the day, climbing steadily, passing crystal clear streams and groves of pine that stretched so high it made your neck hurt to look up. The trail narrowed as we got higher, hugging the edges of ridgelines and cutting through fields of rock and scree. The sky stayed clear, and the sun didn't let up until late afternoon when the shadows started to lengthen and the temperature dropped again. We reached the valley around 6. It wasn't huge, maybe a mile long and a few hundred yards across. Steep, rocky walls flanked either side, rising sharply like the jaws of some sleeping animal. The ground was mostly level at the bottom, covered in a mix of soft pine needles and the occasional patch of moss or wild grass. A narrow creek snaked its way along one edge, fed by snowmelt higher up. We set up our tents near the middle, giving enough space between each for some privacy, but still close enough to keep an eye on one another. I liked the spot immediately, felt isolated but safe. The rocky walls blocked the wind, and the trees offered just enough cover without feeling closed in. We boiled water, made dinner, simple freeze-dried meals, nothing fancy, and sat around talking until the sun disappeared completely and the stars came out. Out there, away from everything, the sky opens up in a way you can't explain unless you've seen it. The stars are sharp and endless. It feels like you're standing at the bottom of the world, looking up into forever. We turned in around 10. I crawled into my tent, pulled my sleeping bag around me, and settled in for what I expected to be a deep, undisturbed sleep. The cold outside crept in fast once I stopped moving, but I'd brought the right gear. I lay there for a while, listening to the water moving through the rocks and the distant hoots of an owl somewhere up the ridge. I must have drifted off around 11. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. Late, sometime deep into the night, the kind of time where the world feels completely still. But it wasn't still. Something had stirred me, and it wasn't subtle. I lay there in the dark, my breath already short, body already tense. Then I heard it again, a deep, dull thud, followed by another, and then the unmistakable grinding sound of stone tearing against stone. It started far away, high up where the rocky walls met the skyline, and it rolled downward with speed. I knew exactly what it was, a rock slide. It wasn't a full-blown landslide, not the kind that wipes out everything in its path. But it wasn't small either. It wasn't a few loose pebbles tumbling lazily down a slope. These were large boulders, crashing through the trees, breaking apart everything they touched. You could hear the weight of them, the force. Each impact sent a shockwave through the valley floor, and for a terrifying moment, it sounded like they were coming straight for us. Couldn't see a thing. Not the outline of the walls, not the tops of the trees, not even the inside of my own tent. It was total black. No moon, no glow. Just the sound of destruction moving closer. My first instinct was to get out, to run. But that passed just as quickly as it came. Because where would I go? Even if I unzipped the tent and jumped out, I wouldn't be able to see the rocks coming. They would be on me before I had a chance to move. And I didn't know which direction they were coming from. The acoustics in that valley bounced sound in strange ways. Could have been 100 yards away or right above me. So I froze. I stayed in the tent, curled in my bag, not breathing, just waiting. My hands were clenched so tight around my sleeping bag that my fingers went numb. Every second felt like an hour. The noise swelled and then dipped and then swelled again. You could hear trees snapping like matchsticks. There was a kind of rhythm to it. Boulder hits ground, boulder hits tree, boulder bounces, boulder keeps falling. It was chaos, but there was some sick pattern to it. I remember trying not to make a sound, as if being quiet would protect me, as if the rocks could hear me. Eventually, the sound slowed. The crashes became fewer. The grinding faded, and then it stopped. Silence returned like it had never left. Complete, total, like nothing had happened. I stayed there, frozen in place for what felt like hours. The cold sank deeper into the tent. My breath fogged the inside of the bag. I couldn't tell if the others were awake, if they'd heard what I heard. I didn't want to call out. I didn't want to break the silence. Eventually, I drifted back into a fitful, shallow sleep. When morning came, I stepped out into the pale blue light just after dawn. The air was still. The valley looked untouched. The others were already up. We didn't say much at first. No one needed to. We all had the same questions in our eyes. We checked the area, walked the edges of the clearing, followed the line of the ridge on both sides as far as we could. There was nothing. No new rock piles, no shattered trees, no scars in the dirt. It was like it never happened. We looked further out, maybe a quarter mile or so up the side of the valley. That's where the walls got steeper and more exposed. Still, nothing obvious. Maybe the rocks had fallen there, far enough away that the damage didn't reach us. The sound would have traveled easily in that place. Echoed down like a warning. I don't know. We never found out for sure. But that feeling, being pinned in place with nowhere to go, no options, no plan, that stayed with me. The pure helplessness of it. That's what I remember the most. Lying in the dark, hearing the earth rip itself apart, and knowing there wasn't a single thing I could do if it decided to take me with it. We stayed one more night. None of us slept well. Every time a branch cracked or a rock shifted under its own weight, I jolted awake. When we left the next morning, the hike out felt longer than it should have. Heavier. I kept thinking about how fast it could have ended. How a boulder the size of a fridge could have flattened me in an instant and I never would have seen it coming. I've camped a lot since then, gone to more remote places, pitched my tent in riskier spots, but that night in the valley left a mark. I still think about it sometimes when I lie down to sleep in the backcountry, when the trees are quiet and the stars are out and the world is still. I think about how thin the line is between being fine and being gone, and how sometimes the only thing that saves you is luck. Not skill, not planning, just blind, stupid luck. And you never really know until morning comes. It was the kind of place you'd think was made for peace. A small wooden cabin deep in the woods, far from any road or sign of human life, surrounded by thick pine trees that blocked out most of the sky. I had rented it for a week to get away from everything. Work stress, city noise, the constant pressure of life. I needed to be alone to reset. What I found instead was a week I'll never forget, for all the wrong reasons. The cabin itself was simple. 2 rooms, a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a bathroom with an old-fashioned pump system for water. There was no electricity, no cell signal. I brought a solar charger for my phone, but mostly I wanted to disconnect. The place had no neighbors, no cars, just the wilderness all around. The first night, the silence was almost overwhelming, but I was too tired to care. I fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the trees. The next morning, I woke early, feeling a strange sense of calm. The sun filtered through the window, making dust particles float in the air. I made coffee on the stove, then took a slow walk around the small clearing the cabin sat in. The forest was dense and dark beyond the clearing, the trees tall and close together, their branches intertwining like fingers. The ground was soft with pine needles and fallen leaves. I felt completely cut off from the world, and for a while it was exactly what I wanted. That day, I unpacked and explored the nearby area on foot. I found a small stream a few hundred meters away, the water cold and clear. I filled my bottle, feeling the crispness of the air and the quiet except for birds and the occasional rustle of small animals. I started a small fire outside the cabin in the fire pit and cooked some simple food. The sun set early behind the trees, and soon it was dark. I lit a lantern inside and read until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. On the 3rd day, something felt off. It started with little things. When I went outside to fetch water from the stream, I noticed broken branches on the path, as if something heavy had pushed through the bushes. But I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. The woods were full of them. Still, I felt like I was being watched. That night, I locked the cabin door carefully, checked the windows, and kept the fire going longer than usual. The wind had picked up, making the trees groan and creak. Outside, in the shadows, I thought I saw movement, something big, just at the edge of the clearing. My heart pounded, but I told myself it was a trick of the light. The 4th day was worse. I woke to find that the firewood I had stacked outside was scattered, some logs knocked over, and footprints around the pile. Large, heavy prints that looked like boots, but I didn't recognize the tread. I had left the area clear when I went to sleep. I tried not to panic. Maybe another camper had passed by, but it didn't make sense. The cabin was deep in the forest, and there were no roads or trails close enough for easy access. I spent most of the day inside, watching the trees through the windows. Around midday, I saw a figure far away between the trees, barely visible. It was human-shaped, but still, I couldn't be sure. The figure didn't move much, just stood there watching the cabin. I froze, heart racing. Then the figure turned and disappeared into the woods. I locked every door and window again, checked my supplies, and prepared to stay alert. The silence was heavier now, the kind that presses down on your mind and makes every small sound feel louder. I told myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, waiting. The next 2 days were a nightmare. I heard noises at night, footsteps crunching on leaves, twigs snapping nearby, the faint but unmistakable sound of breathing outside the cabin. Once, I thought I heard something scraping against the wood of the cabin itself, like claws or maybe a tool. I didn't dare look outside. I had no way to call for help. No cell signal, no neighbors. My solar charger was dead because the weather turned cloudy. The lantern was my only light source, and I kept it close. I slept very little, trying to stay awake as much as possible, listening and watching for any sign of the person outside. One night, I woke up to a loud thud against the cabin wall. It wasn't just a noise. It was a heavy, solid hit, like someone or something had slammed into the wood. Then silence. I stayed frozen, heart pounding, waiting for another sound. Nothing came. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly got up and shone the lantern outside through a window. There was nothing there, but just beyond the clearing, between the dark trees, I saw a pair of eyes reflecting the light. They didn't blink. I felt like I was staring into something dangerous, something alive and waiting. That was when I realized I was in real trouble. This wasn't a game or an accident. Someone was out there, close, and they had been stalking me for days. I had no idea why or what they wanted, but I knew I couldn't stay. I had to get out. The problem was the path back to the main road was over a mile through thick woods, no trail, and I didn't know if the person was watching the only route. The nearest ranger station was hours away by foot. I had no weapon, just a pocket knife. I felt trapped. On the 6th day, I gathered my few supplies, food, water, matches, and waited until early morning when the light was just breaking through the trees. I moved quietly, keeping close to the shadows, trying to avoid open spaces. My heart was in my throat. Every noise made me freeze. Halfway through the woods, I heard a twig snap behind me. I stopped and listened. Footsteps followed, slow and careful, matching my pace. I started walking faster, almost running, but the footsteps kept up, just a little behind me. I dared not look back. The fear was overwhelming. I reached a small stream, which I followed downstream, hoping it would lead to a road or a clearing. The forest was thick, and my legs were tired, but I pushed on. I knew if I stopped, I might be caught. After what felt like hours, I saw a faint dirt road cutting through the trees. Relief flooded me, but I still didn't dare slow down until I was sure I was safe. When I finally stepped onto the road, I saw a car parked about 100 meters away. I waved my arms and shouted, hoping someone was inside. The car door opened, and a man stepped out. I ran to him, out of breath and shaking. He drove me to the nearest town and called the police. When I told them about the cabin, the footsteps, the eyes in the dark, they took me seriously. A search was launched, and the cabin was checked. They found signs that someone had been living rough nearby. A makeshift camp hidden in the woods just a few hundred meters from the cabin. There were scraps of food, a worn sleeping bag, and discarded bottles. They also found a large knife, some rope, and other survival gear. The police told me that area had been known for some illegal activity, people hiding out, sometimes dangerous individuals avoiding the law. It wasn't a fairy tale or some ghost story. It was a real person, a threat, someone who had been watching me and waiting. I was lucky to get out alive. The experience changed me. I learned that nature isn't just beautiful and peaceful. It can hide dangers you don't expect. The isolation, the silence, the feeling of being completely alone can break your mind. But real danger is when you're alone and someone else is out there, watching, waiting. I never went back to that cabin, and I never want to. I don't blame the forest or the wilderness. I blame the person who chose to make that place their hiding spot, the person who decided to stalk a stranger deep in the woods, with no one around to help. Since then, I've become more cautious about what I call alone time. Sometimes, being alone means being vulnerable in ways you can't imagine until it happens. I still like the outdoors, but now I stick to busy places, popular trails, and never stay out of touch with the world. That week in the cabin taught me one clear lesson. The scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're real people, real threats, hidden in places you think are safe. And when you're alone, Sometimes that's the worst kind of fear there is.